Thank you so much. Thanks for being here this morning. 9 a.m. is always not the best time to come, so really appreciate you being here. This is a paper that's written with a colleague of mine, Boriana Milusheva, who I should have changed it. She's not at Princeton, but she was at the University of Toronto. It's sort of an old new project in the sense that we started it a while back. We've been updating it for many years now, but I think we're sort of converging to what it should or can look like. Really good timing for us to get feedback, so don't hesitate to cut me off at any point. So the paper is called Isabelle, Relative, the Health Impact of Changes to Absolute and Relative Income. And so what we're going to be focusing on is the impact of relative income changes on people's health. I do applied micro, so no structural model this morning, no macro, none of the sort. Okay, so obviously I'm not going to teach you anything by saying there's different ways we can think about inequalities, and there's also different ways inequalities can, or different reasons why we should think that inequality might affect people's health. The first one is, as inequality changes, people's absolute level of income changes, and as their absolute level of income change, the literature has taught us that we might expect their health to be affected. Several papers have shown causal or suggest that there's a causal link between absolute level of income and health, through different exogenous changes to stock market returns, housing, wealth, et cetera, and by and large, you all find the magnitude changes, but by and large, everyone finds that there's a causal impact of income on health. If you look at the aggregate level, sometimes people find results that are conflicting in the literature, but looking at the micro individual level, by and large, the richer you are, the healthier you tend to be. The other way, though, that inequality or changes in inequality could affect people's health is through changes in their relative income. So what I have in mind here is your absolute level of income doesn't change, but people's income around you changes. So relatively, you become richer or poorer. And does that impact your health? Here, the literature is a little bit more scant in terms of causal inference. And what people have shown is mostly correlation between people's relative income and their economic satisfaction, their health and longevity. And the papers that surround the literature on the deaths of despair also tend to show that, if you feel like you're lagging behind, this might affect your health behaviors and your health in general. Again, really hard to find, I find, convincing evidence of a causal relationship between both, though, in the literature. Obviously, these two channels have very different implications on people's health based on what type of inequality we think we're going to face. If we're in a situation like we are in Canada, where inequality tended to rise, not because the poor were getting poorer, but because the rich were getting richer in the middle class, and the people with lower income were sort of staying at the same level of purchasing power, well, you wouldn't really care about the impact of inequality on health because no one's really getting poorer if you think that the channel through which inequality affects health is absolute income. If you think that what matters is relative income on people's health, then this type of inequality where the rich is getting richer and everyone else is staying sort of in place really matters for people's health because a lot of people are getting relatively poorer. So what we're going to try to do in this paper is to disentangle the health impact of changes to absolute and relative income on people's health. But to do that, we face two main challenges. The first one is a classic challenge. Income and health are endogenous in each other's production function. So, if you're richer, you tend to be healthier, but also if you're less healthy, there are several reasons that you could rationalize how causally this would make you less rich, either through discrimination, changes in your productivity level, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the first challenge we face. This is not our contribution, not novel. Several people have suggested different ways to address this causal inference problem. We're going to follow the literature in that way. The second challenge, though, which is a bit trickier, is to really disentangle these two channels in a world where absolute and relative income tend to move together. So if your absolute level of income changes, unless everyone else around you has the same change in their absolute income, your relative income will change, okay? And so the fact that these two forces tend to move together is one challenge in identification that we're gonna address in this paper. Yeah?
You seem to be having in the background a constant price per unit of quality of health. And one thing that you might think that you would be changing as you change either absolute or relative income would be the price.
Agreed. So we're going to work with Canadian data here, where at least healthcare is generally at a price of zero, so constant price of zero. Now, one type of price that will change is queues for services. We're trying to address that. I'm not sure it's in a convincing way, so we can discuss this a bit later. But at least in terms of monetary price of healthcare, we're in a sort of all else equal world. Obviously, you know, certain services like physiotherapy, psychotherapy, and all that, prices might change, and that we don't have a good way to deal with that.
Yeah. The relative income is related to your new group?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about this. We're going to define reference group as neighborhoods following the literature, but I'm going to talk about robustness checks that we do as well. Okay, so what we're going to do in this paper, now that the sort of table has been set, is we're going to, and this is going to look far-fetched, but bear with me for 2 minutes and it's going to become clearer. So we're going to exploit the importance and the geographic concentration of the oil industry in Canada to face the two challenges that I've just discussed, okay? The first thing is we're going to address the endogeneity of income as an input in people's health production function, income being either relative or absolute, by using exogenous changes in the price of oil and the fact that some people in the economy have an income that's very linked to changes in the price of oil, okay? And I'm thinking here about obviously people who work in the oil industry. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to try to separately estimate the health impact of changes to absolute and relative income on people's health by exploiting the fact that your relative and absolute income are not necessarily going to co-vary based on your own industry of work. So are you an oil worker or not? And that's going to affect if your income changes as the price of oil moves. And B, who's around you? So basically we're going to define reference groups as neighborhoods. And because of the geographic concentration of the oil industry in Canada, what's going to happen is that in certain neighborhoods, as the price of oil changes, most people in the neighborhood are going to have an income that varies, okay? And you might or might not have an income that varies based on your own industry of work. In other neighborhoods, no oil workers, so no one's income is going to change. Yes?
So how are you going to measure health? Are you thinking...
So we have a crude and dramatic measure of health, which is hospitalizations. I'm going to discuss the data we have, but the only thing we can say is, do you get the most, well, not the most dramatic health outcome, that would be death, but like, do you get a dramatic health outcome as a result of your relative income changing? We now got access to data that I think are going to help us address mechanism, which we don't really do in this paper. So is it like because of changes in consumption of, you know, health-inducing goods, or is it because of stress or whatever? So that we sort of walk around in the paper and address, but not in, you know, a very upfront way. And that other data set has physician visits data instead of just hospitalization. So hopefully that's paper number 2. Yeah.
Should we worry about whether people think about these price shocks as temporary or permanent?
We should. We have sort of evidence that people think that no, that's untrue. Let me rephrase that. By the way our data moves and the income changes that we think people are experiencing, we think that they might anticipate them to be medium-run changes in income, but not necessarily permanent changes in their income. And the results we find are not, I'm not going to tell you, you know, if your neighbors get all richer at the same time and you don't, you will end up in the hospital. It's way weaker than that. So that also suggests that, you know, people probably don't think about this as a permanent income shock. But
yeah, I mean, it just matters for how you think about the framing of the question.
Absolutely, for sure. Okay, so before we go any further, we're just going to discuss two intuitions. Oh, sorry.
So, because you're controlling for neighborhood effects, it's not about the top 1%. So it's just very local effect.
Exactly, yeah.
So, with your estimate, if you had a more homogeneous neighborhood where rich and poor do not live together, they're in separate areas, then health would be good. Because
Sorry.
this is essentially what you are controlling for, right? How heterogeneous is the area that you live?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It might become clearer in like 2 or 3 slides, and if it's not, I can get better at explaining it. Okay, so the first thing we want to assess here is my premise completely silly that people's income are going to change with the price of oil if they work in the oil industry? If that doesn't hold, then there's no paper. Fortunately for us, this seems to hold. There seems to be an opportunity for a paper here. So what I'm showing on this graph is in blue. I'm not sure how well the colors are showing, but this line here is the blue line. That's the price of oil. This line here is the pink line. I'm showing you this graph because it's the most convincing. We have one on weekly earnings as well that looks sort of the same, but it's a bit noisier. This is unemployment, so temporary unemployment, or permanent, but you know, both entering the same. Are you laid off or not, basically? And are you out of work or not? So this is the pink line. And this is the unemployment for people in the oil and gas industry. And the yellow line here is the unemployment for people not in the oil industry. So seems to be, a little bit of things that vary here. But there is a gap between how your probability of unemployment or not being employed, it's not unemployment, it's not being employed, I should be more precise, varies with the price of oil if you're an oil worker versus if you're not. And here what we do is we put that data and run just a simple regression. So this is not the main data for our paper, it's data from the LFS. I'm gonna explain to you why in a second. But if we just put this in a regression and we look at how the price of oil is gonna affect your weekly earnings if you're in the oil industry, seems like it does. If you're not in the oil industry, doesn't seem to be a lot of action. Oil workers earn more than non-oil workers in our sample. One thing we do here is we separate it by gender, just because looking at the data, just looking at the descriptive stats, what we figured out is men in the oil industry tend to work on oil rigs. Women in the oil industry tend to work for companies that are in the oil industry, but they have more like desk job in Montreal or Toronto or whatever. So we don't think of them as having the same type of relationship to the price of oil when it comes to their income. And that relationship is not observed on women, so we're going to work with men for the rest of this paper. We also do it on the full sample, but the results come in when we look at men. Yeah?
I mean, can you tease out the difference between unemployment and wages? And the reason is that unemployment is uncertain, brings stress.
It has its own impact on
independently of any income.
Agreed. So we're not really able to do it because of issues of sample size here, because we're focusing on oil workers. And but in the paper, we do discuss that there's a literature about the health impact of losing your job, irrespective of the income loss. So what we're going to get here is a combination of losing your income and losing your job.
Okay. But
yeah, that's a limit for sure.
A bit of a problem. I mean, not for how you sell.
Yeah. No, for sure. And we do need to be careful about interpretation of the results in that context. Agreed. So that's first step. Then second step is just to get the intuition out as to what we have in mind in terms of neighborhoods and how, what relative income is in our setup. So toy example here, it's a bit more complicated, but let's just look at extreme cases to just set the ideas, okay? So suppose you have two individuals, A and B, who both work in the oil industry. Then you have our individual A, who's going to live in the neighborhood where he's the only oil worker. That never happens in the data, but let's suppose it would, okay? And then we have B, who on the reverse is in a complete opposite situation where he's in a completely 100% oil worker neighborhood, okay? Now suppose that A and B initially have the same income and the same rank in their respective income distribution, the neighborhood income distribution. So here's our baseline situation. Now suppose that there's a decline in the price of oil that's obviously, or exogenous for the purposes of this discussion. So both, or at least from A and B's perspective. So both A and B's absolute level of income, based on the table I just shown you, would be expected to decline with the price of oil, okay? Meaning that they should technically drop in the income distribution if and only if the income distribution around them doesn't move, okay? But what happens here is A works in a neighborhood where no one works in the oil industry, B works in a neighborhood where everyone lives in the oil industry. So what's actually happening is their A is moving along the curve and B is moving with the curve. And so their changes in absolute income may be the same, but their change in relative income is not going to be. And that's what we're going to exploit here in a very, and let me be very honest and open about this, in a very, very reduced form way for reasons that are going to become obvious when I describe the data we're able to use, okay? So here's the data, yeah?
I mean, I'm a bit concerned, it depends what you're finding in the end, but again, if you live in a neighborhood, let's take your exaggeration of 100%, local prices are going to be affected.
Yes, we're going to check that. So we're going to look at alternative mechanisms to explain our story. And because of the time frame we're using, we look at prices moving in that time frame differently across cities where the oil industry is important and the oil industry is not important. We're looking at very short-term effects. So we think we're okay. But then again, if you don't find it convincing, more than happy to find better ways to deal with this. Okay, so the data we're going to use is the linked census hospitalization records in Canada. So basically, it's composed of two data sets. The first one is the 2006 Canadian long-form census, 20% of the Canadian population, representative at a national level, also representative at smaller geography level, which is important for us, obviously. What we do with this data is we're able to identify people working in the oil and gas industry. We do it in two ways, looking just at industry codes or looking at a cross-industry/occupation code where we, find the occupations within the oil industry that are more likely to move, whose income are more likely to move with oil prices. And what we're also able to do with this data set is we're able to find people in each neighborhood, to find a proportion of people in each neighborhood whose income relies on oil, so the people who work in the oil industry. Okay? When I talk about neighborhoods here, I'm only going to talk about urban, I was about to say city neighborhoods, urban neighborhoods, because we don't have neighborhoods of residents for people who live in rural areas. Basically, we use census tracts as neighborhoods. They're going to be defined within census metropolitan areas. Because in rural areas, we don't have census metropolitan areas, we're going to have a code for rural people. So basically, rural people in Quebec and in Alberta are going to have the same residence code. So that would be a very unrealistic and useless neighborhood to use. So we're focusing on urban populations. So we don't do it. The Canada RDC does it for us, for which we're very grateful. So they're going to link this with the discharge abstract database, which is the hospitalization database in Canada. So basically what happens here is we have a cross-section of the population in 2006. And we follow all hospitalization for that cross-section until 2010. Okay, so we see it every time they go to the hospital, we see it. We see why they go, we see who they see what symptoms they have, what procedures are made on them. Is it bad, is it not bad? Do they go through the emergency room? Do they just enter for a scheduled procedure? All this we're able to see, okay? So we're mostly gonna focus on people who come in for a non-scheduled procedure, because obviously the timing matters in our paper. But we're able to do that because of the granularity of the data in this data set. And we're gonna obviously link this to the WTI historical spot prices. We can do it with the WCS, the Western Canadian Standard, so it's the Canadian price of oil. The results are unchanged if we use one or the other. So we're gonna obviously restrict our population to working people, because if we want their income to vary with oil, they need to be working. And we're gonna do subsamples by marital status. That's linked to an identification assumption that I'm gonna discuss a bit later. And then we're gonna collapse all our observations at the individual quarter level. So each individual quarter is gonna be one observation in our data set. We wanted to do it at the monthly level because I think it would have been better, but the RDC computers explode when you do that. So sadly, this is as small an observation as we're gonna get. Probably don't need to discuss that at length here, but I think it's interesting to do that paper in Canada despite certain data limitations because of the reasons we discussed earlier, that is to say healthcare comes at a price of zero. Okay, so one thing you might worry is that as your income changes, your capacity to purchase healthcare changes, at least for hospitals here, which is our observation, shouldn't matter because the price is always zero. Yes?
Just a question, so you focus on working people, the age has disappeared back.
Oh, sorry.
20 to 62, so 20 to 62 in 2006 is
Exactly. So they get to
sure
65.
Because 62, we're talking about people working in oil industry, so this is rough jobs. So are you sure that...
We did it for 50, 55. Like we tried different benchmarks just to make sure that it was insensitive to the, it's roughly the same. The only thing is as we shrink the age, we also shrink sample sizes. So the sweet spot seems to be this, but our results don't seem to be dependent on it. We also tried later, like 65 in 2006, but again, it's a bit more unrealistic to think that these are still working people. Yeah, so basically that's why I think it's, that's my pitch as to why we should use Canadian data even though it's a small country. Okay, empirical approach. So our main, I didn't wear my watch, am I doing terribly on time?
9:20.
Okay. Great. Okay, so here's our main estimating equation. As I told you, it's reduced form. I'm not going to do anything fancier than that in this paper. Looking forward to developing this question more. So if you have any suggestions as to how to get more into the weeds, more than happy to discuss it. Here's what we can do with what we have for now. That being said, I keep downplaying the paper. I do think this question is not being addressed in the research agenda of this field. So I do think it's interesting to look at what we have, even though it's reduced form. Again, you can tell me if you
Why
disagree.
do you apologize so much for reduced form? Do you think a structural model would be more convincing?
I've got that comment a lot.
I mean, I don't know where you
I think I anticipated before people tell me.
I would not apologize for doing it.
Okay. well, thank you. Gonna stop here then. So here's our model. Okay, basically simple triple difference model. So what we have here is we have obviously changes in price of oil, that's beta 2, changes in the price of oil interacted with, no, that's not true, sorry, beta 2 is are you an oil worker? Beta 1 is changes in the price of oil, beta 3 is the interaction between both, and then in beta 4 here, we have the interactions of the price of oil, if you're an oil worker, as the share of oil workers in your neighborhood vary. Okay, so M is the, subscript for a neighborhood, and I is individual. Then we have changes in the price of oil as the share of oil changes for people who don't work in the oil industry, just how having people in the oil industry matters in your health, and then a bunch of controls. So we're going to control for as much as we can see in the census. That's a rich set of covariates. That's one of the advantages of working with the census is we know people's age, their gender, are they married or not, what's their level of education, in which province do they live, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to put all this in the X. In certain specification, we're going to put individual fixed effects because we have a panel of hospitalization, so we're able to do that. Doesn't matter much, but know that we can change this for an individual fixed effects and it still works. And then we're going to have obviously period fixed effects, quarter fixed effects, just to account for the seasonality in which things move. And we also control for people's absolute level of income. In 2005, which is the year before the census. So what we could do is just estimate this and show you estimates for beta 4 and beta 5. The story we get would be consistent with what I'm going to show you today, but obviously it's a triple interactions with continuous term. So it's a bit messy to interpret when you get to this point. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to focus on two coefficients, beta 1 and beta 3. When we recenter the value of the variable share oil around different values. Okay, so I'm going to give you a recipe here. So what we do is, if we were just estimating this, basically beta 1 and beta 3 would be interpreted as the changes in the price of oil and the changes in the price of oil if you're an oil worker, when no one else around you works it, when the variable share oil has a value of 0, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to recenter the variable share oil around different values, call them Z for now, okay? And as we do that, the interpretation of beta 1 and beta 3 changes, obviously. It becomes the impact of a change in the price of oil, if you're an oil worker or not, as Z% people work in the oil industry in your neighborhood. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this equation and re-estimate it a bunch of times, changing the value Z we have to account for different points in the distribution of neighborhoods with different oil workers in our sample, okay? And I'm going to map these values beta 1 and beta 3 to see how the impact of a change in the price of oil is going to vary for oil workers and then for non-oil workers as the share of people working in the oil industry around them varies. Okay?
Why don't you just look at your distribution of proportions, put it into quintiles, and fully interact it with all the quintiles?
So we tried that too. It's sort of the same, but the action we get, and you'll see, but the action we get is not in the top quintile. It's in the top 1% of neighborhood with a lot of oil workers. Because in our top 1% of neighborhoods with oil workers, we have 25% of people who work in the oil industry. If I look at the top 10% of neighborhoods with oil workers, there's like 3% of oil workers in there. So there's really a bunch of neighborhood up there where there's a lot of oil workers, and then a majority of neighborhoods who don't. So that's sort of the way we manage to really get to the tail, and that helps us to interpret our results better, because our results are really coming at the very top of the end, at the very end of the distributions, at the very end of the distribution of oil-concentrated neighborhoods, and those are not a big proportion of all neighborhoods in Canada. And as you would expect, they're all in Newfoundland or Alberta. So then we did a certain analysis focusing just on Alberta or just in Newfoundland to see how things would happen. And it's a lot of robustness checks in here because obviously it's reduced form, so we have to play around to try to interpret our results in the right way. But yeah, so if we do quintiles, which we've done, we don't find anything because in the top quintile.
No, I believe you, but then I would just state what you're stating now and go to
And
your
go.
top 1%? Or?
Okay. So that I've already said. Okay, so here are our results. So the first thing I'm going to show you is for oil workers, what's the impact of changes in the price of oil on their probability of hospitalization. As I said earlier, we focus on hospitalizations that don't look like they're planned. Okay, so they're all hospitalizations that seem to happen because your health status is degraded in a way that you weren't going to predict. So no hip replacement. Well, obviously there's 65-year-old people, so hip replacements are not that common, but things that you would expect to change with your income. But for now, we're looking at all conditions that we expect would move with income. I'm going to get more granular later. So here, what we have is if you've got, if you're in the 10th percentile of neighborhoods with a low concentration of oil workers, what happens to your health as your income changes, And then what we see is something that I wasn't expecting. So people's health seems to be pretty unchanged when their income changes, except if they're in a neighborhood where a lot of other people have an income that increases because of oil prices change. Okay, so it's like there's some form of, positive externalities that come from working with people living with people whose income increases if your own income increases as well, okay? These impacts are statistically significant. As I was saying, it's in the top 1% of neighborhoods that with oil workers that we get them. So when, there's a fifth of people around you who work in the oil industry. Yeah.
Is there any way you can distinguish whether these may not be people who came to the neighborhood
because of oil changes?
Because of oil changes and because they're the type of people who can move for a job opportunity, they might be healthier than others?
So I completely forgot to say that, but you're right. Here, that's what we're trying to do. We're focusing only on married men. Why do we do this? Because in the census, we have a cross-section. We don't see where people move after. Well, we can see, do they go to the same hospital, which is a good proxy for did they move cities. That doesn't tell us if they change neighborhoods, though. You could change neighborhoods in the same city, but then that would be a bit strange. Like, you wouldn't move neighborhoods because the price of oil changes. So because we're limited in this way, we have longitudinal health data, but we don't have longitudinal residential data. What we do is we do these graphs for all male, but we also do them for married male, because in other data sets, we're able to see that married people tend to move less as the price of oil changes. So if I go back to the LFS, which is the data I showed you before, what we found in there is that indeed, single young male tend to move to, and that's like the Le Mieux Fortin paper, like Joseph Marchand also has paper on this, on the Canadian economy. When the price of oil changes, people will move to opportunities, especially if they're young and unattached. So what we do here is we only, I'm showing you the best results. If we do it for all male, it's like very close to not being statistically significant. I think that's partially because people move, right? So then we're measuring everything with error as we apply the methodology we apply. If we focus on married men, we have evidence that they're less likely to move, and so that they're more likely to have their relative and their absolute income change in the way we expect it to.
I think I'm still struggling a little bit with that. So what mechanism do you have in mind?
Right here, I can't say anything, but then I'm going to focus on mental health, hospitalization, and the channel I have in mind is stress, psychosocial stress.
So not necessarily physical,
no.
Physical effects from improvements.
No, it seems to be a death of despair story. So everything comes from, liver-related hospitalizations, self-harm, psychiatric hospitalizations.
So then again, it comes back to basically perceived health status.
Yeah.
In terms of mental health.
Yeah, mostly. Which again makes sense to me, because what we're doing is we're using quarters. Like, again, I don't think I was very transparent about that, but in my equation you probably saw, like the price of oil it's changing the price of oil from one quarter to the other. So because it's so short term, what I would expect to find is something that's mental health related. If it was physical health related, I'd probably doubt my results a little bit, because it takes more time to change. Let's look at the same graph, but for non-oil workers now. So what we have here is for people who are the only people who live with other people who are non-oil workers. As the price of oil changes, their probability to be hospitalized doesn't change. Now, if you live in these neighborhoods where you have 16% and more oil workers around you, so the income distribution starts to shift as the price of oil changes, now you're more likely to show up to the hospital, even though your absolute income hasn't changed. So that's the trick here, or that's what we interpret as, can we disentangle changes in your relative income from changes in your absolute income? And for these people, we would expect that their absolute income doesn't change. In fact, back to the table I showed you earlier, that seems to be the case, right? That seems to be born in the data for the same time period, same group of people. Here, though, their relative income is changing, because we also know that people around them have an income that increases. Okay, so for these people, the probability of hospitalization increases as their relative income decreases because of changes in the price of oil. Haven't talked about magnitudes yet, but what we find is for oil workers, if you're in the top oil working neighborhoods, a $10 increase in the price of oil across a quarter is going to decrease your probability of hospitalization by 1.3 to 4.3%. These are not percentage points, they're percent. Probability of hospitalization in a single quarter is 2% in our data. Okay, so that's very small. That's a very small result. It's 1.3 to 4.3% of 2 percentage points. Yes? Yeah.
So if you want to take into account what is the effect of absolute income, why don't you focus on the individuals that don't work in the oil sector? And they live in neighborhoods that there is a positive price of, everyone around them work in the oil sector, they get a positive source to their income, but they don't.
So basically, chop my sample, remove oil workers from it, and run the same regressions in a double like just with an interaction instead of a triple interactions with a.
Yeah, keep the oil there because it's relevant for that person, but run the regression for non-oil workers.
I mean, I think that would be a great suggestion.
And it
makes so much sense.
Me too, and now I wonder why we haven't done that. So I'm definitely going to note it down. Because it would get rid of parameters basically, and it would make everything clear.
Your sample is going to become so much larger too.
Yeah. Yeah. Note it down. We might have done it and something didn't work, and I completely, as I told you, this is an old paper, so I think we have many folders of results that are not there, but definitely going to run it on this. What I'm not showing here is we also have like a complete section on the impacts of absolute income because we wanted to see, I'm not showing it here because it's not new, like tens of thousands of people have done that, but we have it in the paper just to make sure that we can replicate what exists in the literature. So I think that's one reason why, but it doesn't explain why we wouldn't get rid of oil. Yeah, okay, great, thank you.
So for the oil workers, you do this with the oil price, but initially you showed us something about the unemployment rate for oil workers. Right?
Yeah.
Have you done this with that too? Because it could be about income, but it could be about being unemployed when other people are working.
So I don't think we're able to separate this here because we don't see people longitudinally in terms of their work status or their neighborhoods.
No, but you're assuming that the aggregate oil price affects incomes of oil workers.
Yeah.
Right? So in a way, you could use the overall unemployment rate for oil workers. That's like just.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I didn't understand your question. Yeah, we could probably do that too. Actually, that's a good suggestion. Yeah, and that we could get from the LFS pretty easily. Thank you. Okay. Again, just in terms of giving you the magnitude that come with the previous graph, so what we find for non-oil workers is that a $10 increase in the price of oil, so a decrease in people's relative incomes, is going to lead to a 0.4 to 1.6% increase in the probability of hospitalization. Again, percent, not percentage points. So, hospitals are not going to get overcrowded because the price of oil changes, that's for sure. But there seems to be something that we're able to get that's statistically significant and that we, again, when I show you other results, seems to make sense. So as I told you, these are results for married men because we think they're less mobile. If we run everything on a full sample, we get the same type of qualitative results. It's just that the magnitude is going to be smaller even, and the estimates are noisier because I think that our identifying assumption here isn't satisfied when we look at all males, and that we don't assign them the right industry of work necessarily, and we don't assign them the right neighborhoods necessarily. For some of them, for most of them we will, but for a fraction we won't, in a way that's not exogenous. one alternative explanation here is, what are we getting? Are we getting the change in relative income on people's health, or are we getting changes in their purchasing power with how that changes in purchasing power is going to affect their health? And I think that goes to your question as, as the incomes of oil workers increase in oil-intensive neighborhoods, we could expect local prices to change, and then our story about relative income could be a story about purchasing power. So that's what I just said. So what we can do, the best we can do here is look at movement in price, and this is in relation to movement in oil prices coming from other data sets, because we don't have price data or local price data in our data set. I wanted to do this by neighborhoods. I haven't found a data set to do that. If any one of you has suggestions, I'll be the happiest person in this room. But for now, what we do is we look at it between oil-intensive cities and non-oil-intensive cities, looking at CPI prices that are posted by city by Statistics Canada. Okay? So here what I have is the all-items CPI. Obviously, the level of prices is not the same in different cities. Montreal and Toronto are in the yellow line. Towns in Alberta are in the pink line, so prices are lower. But the co-movement in prices seems to be the same, regardless of what type of neighborhood you live in, and not move, differentially with oil prices. We can do it with only the price of shelter costs, sorry. And if we do that, we get the same type of things. We run it with regression form, because obviously, we can look at a graph and we can say what we want by squinting our eyes. So if we run a regression, we get the same type of evidence. So that's not to say that we can totally convincingly discard this hypothesis, because as I said, we don't have data at the neighborhood level, but at least when we look at cities, I think it's reassuring that what we're getting is not exclusively a purchasing power story. Yeah?
Wasn't that showing that there was a positive relationship? Or am I not seeing it?
In all neighborhoods, but not specifically for oil intensive.
Sorry.
Yeah, for sure. Because in the all CPI, we're going to get the price of gas. We're going to get so yeah. Okay, data limitations and potential threats to identification, and how we think it matters for our results. So first one is, obviously there might have wages spillovers to other industries.
Can I ask one quick question?
Yeah.
Did you look for asymmetries between price decreases and price increases?
We're doing that right now. That's the last step before we submit it. It's a bit tricky. The way we do it, and if you have better suggestions, more than happy to take them. The way we do it for now is we, separate our sample by quarters, and we look at price increases, price decreases, and then run everything with an interaction as to was it an increase, was it a decrease. What we get, and that's why I've spoken about everything in terms of changes in the oil prices increasing, is what we seem to get is oil increases is where we get our action from. Like, we don't get anything statistically significant from oil price decreases, but we have more oil increasing. I keep saying oil increases, but oil is not increasing, it's price increases. So we have more quarters in our data where the price of oil increases than when it decreases. So is the asymmetry caused by small, the distribution of the number observation across our sample, or is it due to a real asymmetry in the mechanism? I'm not convinced yet, but we're still working on this. Okay, so possible wage spillovers to other industry. So one could think that increases in the price of oil might also increase the income of oil workers in oil-intensive neighborhoods because of increased demand for services or for their local activity. So first, we can test that. We don't find evidence of it in our data, again, using the LFS. Second, even if it did happen, it would work against us finding something, right? Because we would overestimate the change in relative income. Not we would overestimate, but we would overstate in our approach the change in relative income that we get for non-oil workers in oil-intensive industries. So basically, we're thinking that they have a bigger change in their relative income that they actually have, and so that should work against us finding the relative income effects that we find, and we still find them. So that's kind of reassuring. But for sure, this is something that might be going on in the background. Fortin and Lemieux have a paper that seems to suggest that if these dynamics happen, they should be more important in oil-intensive neighborhoods. Again, fortunately, that would work against us. Second data limitation that becomes a potential threat to identification is it is possible that there's changes in neighborhoods' industrial composition as the price of oil changes, right? These things are not perfectly exogenous. So again, to your story, if when the price of oil increases, people from other neighborhood come to that neighborhood to work because they want to benefit from that increase in their potential wages, then again, that would lead us to mismeasure the share oil variable as we move along our panel data. Because again, remember, we don't observe it, we base ourselves on what we see in 2006. Again, if that happens, that should work against us finding our main findings, which is the relative income story, because what would happen is we would, again, underestimate the share of oil workers in oil-intense neighborhoods. Okay? So possible, but again, should work against us. Third data limitation that leads to a potential threat to identification is there is a possible migration of workers. Now, we've discussed that point at length, so I'm not going to bore you with it. But know that that's why we do it for married men separately and then for all males. And our results come from married individuals who are less likely to move. We do a bunch of sensitivity analysis, falsification tests, because again, this is reduced form, so a lot of things could be going on in the background that we don't address directly. So we're going to first look at an alternative neighborhood definition. What we use for now is census tract. It makes sense, right? Because the number of people who live in a census tract feel more like a neighborhood than people living in a city or other things. However, one other measure of geographic location that we have in the data is census subdivision. So think of a city, a town, whatever, municipality. So we can use that as a neighborhood definition and rerun everything with those different neighborhoods. Obviously, this leads to a lot more heterogeneity in neighborhood sizes. So Toronto becomes a neighborhood, which I don't find really convincing. But we do it just because why not? Montreal is a neighborhood, but then Saint-Laurentide with a few thousand people is also a neighborhood. So it's not clear here what we have in mind in terms of neighborhood, but some people have done it, so we just do it to make sure. It has the advantage of capturing rural areas because you have census subdivisions in rural areas and you don't have census tracts in rural areas. When we do that, everything becomes way less precisely identified, but things move in the same direction. I don't think these results are interesting because, as I said, I don't think you can think of Toronto as a neighborhood, but if you want to do that, you won't get statistically significant results. I'm going to be very transparent, but at least things move in the same direction. Then what we do is, instead of looking at the probability of hospitalization in a given quarter, which is our main dependent variable, what we're going to do is we're going to do an inverse hyperbolic sign transformation and look at the number of hospitalizations an individual has in a quarter. Now you can think of, there's very few people who get hospitalized more than once, so the difference between this and having a binary variable is not tremendous. But if we want to do this, we also get very similar patterns, similar magnitudes, not much changes. We can include individual fixed effects because obviously we have a panel in terms of hospitalizations. When we do that, not much changes, which again isn't really surprising because changes in the price of oil shouldn't be because of the variation we're using basically. And the final thing we do is we use placebo industry. So we're going to run the entire, because we could just be getting this by luck, right? Or we could be getting this by using other types of industries, and then that would be concerning for the interpretation of our findings. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at workers in 2 other industries. We can do it for a bunch of other industries, but I don't want to show you 25 graphs. So we can replace the oil industry by another industry and then run the same thing, knowing that people working in these other industries shouldn't have an income that varies with the price of oil. And obviously that we can check as well, which we do in the OFS. So we're going to use nursing and residential care facilities and hospitals. I'm going to show you these ones just because the share, share of people working in these industries across neighborhoods seems to have geographic concentrations. You can think of, Toronto, Montreal having a high concentration of these workers, and Saint-Laurentide, no. And there's also this similar proportions of people working in this industry than in the oil industry, so that's kind of useful to think about. And then we're going to use a professional, scientific, and technical services industry for the same reasons. So it's the same. We still keep the changes in the price of oil as a variable in our setup, but we're just going to interact it with an industry that doesn't make sense to see what we find. Okay? Oops. And do I have time to show you?
You have 15 minutes.
Ah, tons of time. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do though. So if I take these industries, the patterns sort of follow a similar thing, but the estimates are all very close to 0. The magnitude is much smaller than what we got with the oil industry. That's for changes in the price of oil and the probability of hospitalization of nursing home and hospital workers. Now for non-working homes and hospital workers, we do get that decrease here, which is completely different from what we got when we were looking at non-oil workers. But again, like everything is extremely, just look at the size of the coefficient, like it's nothing. And then if I do it for professional, scientific, and technical services worker, again, it's the same equation. We're still exploiting the price of oil, just interacting it with industries that shouldn't matter, and it doesn't matter. Okay. So, no. So that's reassuring. Sorry.
Have you thought about checking whether, I mean, not checking, but actually just expanding what you do to, say I'm trying to think about the industries in Canada, like the lumber industry?
With the price,
price
or changes in tariffs at the border, or
not as a placebo, but just to show that this is something that's not very special to oil.
To the oil industry. Yeah. So we've toyed around the idea of doing it with financial sectors in a financial crisis, but then too many things were.
No, but
it was affecting everyone in too much a way.
Why not lumber?
It's a good idea.
And I would say lumber, and what is your other thing here? Fish of some sort?
You could do exchange rates and export it from industries. That sounds right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you have to look at the past. I mean, I don't know. Past.
I don't know, like I know that in the development setting people do that.
But that gets passed on.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I'll check because it would be really neat to be able to find it in several settings, and then it becomes way more convincing. Yeah. It's not just about oil people, for sure, or Alberta, for that matter. Yes.
I was thinking, since you focus on the neighborhood, most of the lives on the neighborhood level, right?
Yeah.
So would it make sense to have a special correlation model where you try to predict hospitalizations, and then if the residuals among neighborhoods that are very close to each other?
Yeah.
So maybe it's a more clear effect than oil, because we take
Yeah.
the distance.
Yeah, that makes
Now
sense.
it's only one dimensional. You only restrict the answers on this.
Yeah. The final thing I wanted to show you is potential pathways. So we've discussed it a bit. I sort of gave you the punchline already, but just, because I think it's nice to talk about it. One final question we had is, what type of health outcomes changes as your relative income changes? And as I said, if we'd found stuff like, I don't know, how do you say that in English? Like when appendices crises, or like something that's relative, that should be relatively random to your income, then we would have worried. So what we wanted to do is, because we have all these ICD codes in the data, let's just look at different types of conditions, right, to see where the action is coming from. I have a particular interest for mental health questions, so that was also a sort of fun thing for me to do. So obviously, one way we started motivating this paper, and that's not how we do it now, but it still fits within the literature, I think, is the case in Eaton papers, where the impact of falling behind seems to have impacts on people's health behaviors and potentially health outcome, mortality, et cetera. And so we wanted to test if that seemed to be what was happening in our data. So what they do in their papers is they call deaths of despair stuff like drug poisoning, drug overdoses, opioids obviously come in there, alcohol-related liver diseases, and suicide. What we can do in our data is focus on a subset of hospitalizations that are caused by similar conditions, again, using ICD codes. We also do it looking at, like, were you admitted by a psychiatrist? Did you go to the emergency? Did you go to the emergency for a psych reason? And when we change these definitions, not just looking at ICD codes, the results also hold. So we're going to look at ICD codes for drug and alcohol poisoning, mental health and psychiatric episodes, and self-harm. What we do here, though, has to be a bit more subtle, because if we only want to look at this as an outcome, this becomes a very, very, very rare event. As I told you, 2% of people get hospitalized in a given quarter in our data. If we look at this small subset of conditions, think of a fraction of a percent of people who get hospitalized every quarter. So if I try to run the same regression as I did before, nothing shows up, like absolutely nothing. The probability of this happening is just too low, right? So what we're going to do is conditional on being hospitalized. we run the same model to tell if that, or to look at if this hospitalization was caused by one of the three reasons I showed you. What we have here is for married men who work in the oil industry, we have this pattern which seems to suggest that the probability of hospitalization, given that you're hospitalized for a mental health reason, declines as you live in an oil-concentrated neighborhood, but it's not statistically significant. Here it's not statistically significant either, but the magnitude of our impacts is bigger and the relationship goes in the direction we think. So conditional on being hospitalized, is your hospitalization more or less likely to be due to a mental health reason for non-oil workers? And we get the exact same pattern as we had before, just not statistically significant. I think this is a sample size issue. If we do it with other conditions, we don't get that same pattern, which is why I attribute our main results to these factors rather than other conditions. But here we do have qualitative evidence, if not quantitatively statistically significant, that these reasons seem to be driving the bus.
So suppose I admitted for liver failure.
Yeah.
That would be included in your case? It's just like there are a lot of things that, it depends on how exactly you code it on admission. So liver failure could be caused by all types of things, but also be caused by drugs.
Yeah, so we have, the ICD code is desegregated, if I remember properly, but I wouldn't make up on my own first.
Using pure medical literature on standard symptoms that...
Yeah, so what we do is...
So you probably just slicing data too much. There might be a lot of...
Oh, I see what you mean.
Including
okay.
Technically are that sort of spare factors, but it's,
it's more subtle than what we use, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Very, very strong symptoms of most likely alcohol overuse type of thing, and it's they probably would like that, which is why liver failure.
Yeah, fair point. Yeah.
Just to give it a higher chance of even getting anything significant.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think at first we were sort of really concerned about not including anything we shouldn't be including, but we might be too restricted in here. That's a good point.
So you're looking at a very high frequency, right? But for death of despair, I don't know, despair takes some time maybe, right? And
yeah.
Liver to fail, that's not going to happen in a quarter, right? So have you looked at some horizon out?
We haven't. I think that's why we so these could happen, it could just be a shock and then you get into a desperate condition straight away. So overdoses, you don't need to be using drugs for a long time before you overdose. You could just, have a strong reaction to a dramatic condition. We haven't done longer lags, and that's because we wanted to focus on the lags where we could see movement in incomes matter. And I'll have to wrap my head, I'm sure there's a way, you're right, I'm sure there's a way to look at, longer health condition based on past changes in the price of oil, but then the price of oil will keep moving.
I don't think he's saying longer health conditions. I think he's saying that it takes time to notice that this price changes happen, therefore the income has changed, or maybe.
Right, so it might be.
It's not like, oh my God, my neighbors are wealthier all of a sudden.
Okay, so you're thinking of using a longer lag than a quarter in our main specification.
Exactly, or maybe it's sort of the cumulative oil price change
over
some horizon or something.
Yeah.
Like basically, it's going to give you more chances, right? And for some of these things, it's going to be more positive.
Yeah. So what we did was to use 2 quarters. We did play around with a quarter definition, and we stuck with the one that gave the strongest first stage result. So the results are a little bit weaker if we look at 6 months rather than 3 months. But cumulative is a good idea. We haven't done that. No. Okay, so to conclude, what we've done in here is we're basically trying to disentangle the impact of absolute and relative income absolute and relative changes to your income on the probability that you get hospitalized, which we interpret as being a health outcome. One thing I think that's neat with this is most of the literature looking at relative income mostly relies on, one moment of the income distribution around people, and they're going to use this, put it as an input in a regression, run the regression of do you go to the hospital or are you sick based on your income and the average income in your neighborhood in a very static way. I think what we do here improves on this literature because we're looking at individuals moving along the income distribution, and we're not relying on the average income in your neighborhood. We're looking at are there people around you who get richer, and how does that make you feel potentially worse and decreases your health if your own income doesn't move along these people's incomes which are increasing. So what we do when we do that is we find dividends that, again, for less mobile men, so the ones that are most likely to meet the story we have in mind and the way we can address it in the data, absolute income can have a protective effect on their health if and only if they live with other people who have that same change of income. So it's like a group effect, it seems. However, if you live in that same neighborhood where people's income increases and your own income doesn't increase, that's where we find a negative impact on your health, which we interpret as, your relative income decreasing might be worrisome in terms of what can happen to your health, most specifically your mental health. Again, the effects are potentially coherent with mental health struggle, and although the results are small, I think the fact that they're statistically significant in the sea of observations that we have in the very few oil-intensive neighborhoods that we have is reassuring and interesting. And the results are non-trivial when we compare them to the baseline probability that you get hospitalized. So that's most of what I had this morning. Thank you so much for all your comments and questions and for listening most importantly.